The eviction notice flapped like a white flag against the rusted gate of the two-room flat, while Amina, apron stained with stew and regret, pressed the last of her tips into the old woman's palm and felt the landlord's shadow move closer. If they lost that flat, her little brother would be out of school, and her mother's pills would stop, and everything she had worked for would be swallowed by the gutter outside. Who followed her with that quiet persistence, stepping between the danfo horns and the hum of generators? And why had he watched her give away the very coins that kept her going? The rumor had already, strangely, almost dangerously, picked a shape on the lips of the street. A billionaire followed a waitress who gave away her tips. But the truth was softer and harder than anyone expected, and someone with dangerous power was listening until the moment he could not listen any longer. What he saw next would make him put down his coffee in a way that felt like breaking a bone. Amina's ordinary world was a map of small, sacred debts. The grocery credit at Mama Saad's stall, the school fees due for little Emeka, the rent that belonged to the landlord, Mr. Bakari's ledger, and not to the heart that lived in the courtyard, and the Blue Drum Bistro, where she served lunch under the humming light of a single stubborn bulb. She loved the way her mother's laugh filled the tiny room, and the way Emeka arranged his books like a parade every evening. And though the city around her glittered with glass towers and air-conditioned anonymity, she kept her faith in the simple thing, that kindness, ones she could dish out because she had so little, made life bearable. Night after night, she returned to the flat smelling of oil and pepper, counting tips into a battered tin with a careful hand, and when she couldn't help someone, she often did it anyway, even if it meant missing a meal. The whisper that a billionaire followed a waitress who gave away her tips had the bolder people on the corner laughing. But for Amina, it was just noise. Until the day the landlord's notice changed everything, and a man in a blue cap took a photograph without her knowing. The event that shattered the routine came wrapped in concrete and a developer's smile, a glossy proposal to buy their block and build a mall, a sweet handshake for Mr. Bakari, and a cold fact for Amina. If he sold, every family on the stretch would be pushed to places they could not afford. At the bistro, Fisayo, the manager, clapped her shoulder and said, "You work hard, Amina. We'll find you better hours." But the same Fisayo signed late-night papers with a developer who promised shiny checks, and when Amina confronted him, he only pressed a napkin into her palm and promised a reference while doors were quietly sealing. Outside, the man in the blue cap who had been following her vanished into a crowd of school children. But the camera on his phone had caught 100 small acts and one large injustice. And it was those pictures that would trouble the quiet behind his smile, as if someone wealthy had finally decided that watching was not enough, and as if watching might mean choosing. But what would he choose to do about what he had seen? The first trial sharpened like a knife. The bistro's weekend rush left Amina exhausted, and the owner cut hours to trim costs. And every shilling she lost meant a missed dose for Mama, and another unpaid school book. She began to skip lunch and gave away her tips to kids who sold sugarcane on the street, to men whose boots leaked oil, and to an old woman who mended shoes for a half-day's wage. And Fisayo watched with a smile that looked like encouragement but smelled of a ledger. "You're wasting yourself on strangers," he told her one afternoon with the tenderness of a benefactor. Then he handed a signed letter to the landlord promising the owners would be gone by the month's end. And Fisayo's eyes were warm enough to hide the contract he had already countersigned with the man who would profit from their loss. The hint of a richer life, one where bills evaporated and choices multiplied, hung in the air like the smell of rain on red earth. But Amina could not step into that life because the path was already being paved over the homes of the people she loved. Pattern broke 2 days later when Emeka came home from school with his sweater wet from the harmattan, and 2 sentences that rearranged her day. They said if someone doesn't pay Mama's clinic fees, the boy will be sent home, he said. And Amina felt every tooth of the city gnaw at her courage. She ran to the market, the dust rising in small ghosts beneath danfo horns, and put her hand, for the first time, over the tin of tips and counted 1, 2, 3 lunches worth, and made a decision on the pavement in front of a radio store. She gave the coins to the nurse at the clinic, who pressed her fingers and said, "Bless you, child," before turning away with the officiality of someone who sees crises all day. And somewhere in the crowd, a man in a cheap cap watched, and his eyes went liquid. That night, Mr. Bakari Post had another notice, thicker, final. The developer's bulldozer's license was signed, and the camera in the blue cap had already started a small, dangerous storytelling. Trial 2 arrived as betrayal wrapped in soft words and bread. A churchwoman named Mama Efe, who fed stray dogs and handed out evening prayers, told Amina she had a contact who could take her case to someone important, and asked Amina to give her all the tips she had saved for the week under the pretense of raising a communal fund. "It's for the children," she said, touching Amina's wrist with the practiced warmth of someone who knew how to read a child's hunger. Amina, who had learned that charity needed practice to be trusted, gave over the coins with a prayer in her mouth. But when the communal fund was later revealed as a private envelope for Mama Efe's niece's wedding dresses, the thinness of used kindness became a blade in Amina's palms. The betrayal burned farther when Fisayo offered to help negotiate with the developer while privately pocketing a finder's fee. And the man everyone called a friend was a wolf in sheep's clothing, with a business card and a ledger for his prayers. The city, always loud, now felt like a closing door, and someone with more money than sense was watching how she gave away the very things that made survival possible. The fourth obstacle arrived with time and a threat. Mr. Bakari, whom everyone had trusted because he once shared yams on festival days, brought the bailiffs with him and set a deadline, 3 days to vacate, or they would force everyone out by dawn with the law at their backs. The courtyard, that had been a place of prayer and gossip, felt suddenly like a chessboard, each family a pawn. And Amina's choices multiplied into impossible sums. Pay the landlord the entire month's rent plus debt, find a new place in a city where rents climbed like fever, or watch their life scatter on the roadside. The Blue Drum Bistro drip of air, butting the bright lights of the new towers, made her feel small and loud at once. And in the dark, the blue-capped man took a photograph of her giving a handful of tips to a child who had lost his mother. The camera captured the angles of her kindness, and the man who had been a watcher now bore witness. What would a billionaire do with an image like that, and why had he followed her so closely? Then came the pattern interrupt, a sudden rain that made the red earth smell like memory and knocked the day flat, forcing everyone to pause on the cobbled pavement and lift their faces as if waiting for an answer from the sky, while the danfo horns dimmed into something like breathing. In the market, with the rain clinging to braids and the generator humming like a distant heartbeat, Amina gave her last tips to a street sculptor whose hands were frozen from the cold, and he smiled as if he had been gifted a son. The moment was small but precise, the kind of moment that had weight when stacked. The blue-capped man stepped into the cover of a garage with his camera phone hot in his palm, and for a beat the world narrowed to the two of them and the thinness of the money separating a roof and a ruin. The rain ended and the city resumed, but the question of what? One who could buy whole streets had been watching her extra closely braided itself into the night. Seeded into the wet earth of that night was an act of kindness that would later be remembered like a prophecy. When the clinic asked for extra help to keep a child on a drip, Amina signed a small waiver that allowed the boy to stay because she had convinced the nurse the family would raise the funds. She lied with the conviction of someone who believed the truth would come later. And then, in earnest, she spent 2 nights running a tray of cold food to the family's doorstep, giving them her tips as if they were offerings to a temple of mercy. What made this seed different was that it was witnessed not only by the family and the nurse, but by the man who had been following her. He watched from a distance under an acacia tree, his breath clouding in the harmattan like a thought, and took notes not only in his phone but in the quiet ledger of his conscience. He would later say that he couldn't sleep because the image of her hands kept returning, an image of a woman with nothing giving away everything. And somewhere in his chest, something shifted. He would remember the names of the people she saved as if they were a map. It mattered that he saw it because he had power the size of a town and a secret heart that had begun to crack. The pressure cooker tightened into hours. The bailiff set the exact time for eviction at dawn in 3 days. The bistro cut her shifts to 1 day a week to test new staff. And the clinic called to say the last of Mama's pills would be sold if the payment did not arrive by the end of the week. Amina counted coins like prayer beads on a floor that still smelled faintly of last week's jollof and felt each one like a decision with teeth. She wrote a letter to the school begging for mercy and wore Emeka's school sweater to hide the tears when he asked why his mother was quiet. The blue-capped man, who had been a ghost in the crowd, began to leave small envelopes anonymously on the steps of the clinic and the bistro, just enough to cover a night, not enough to buy the silence of debt, complicating the moral topography of his presence. Was he a savior, a voyeur, or a judge? The city seemed to contract around their breaths, a clock on every corner. And whether Amina could keep her dignity was now a matter of hours that could not be bought. At the story's hinge, the hidden identity that had been hinted at for weeks unfolded like a map. The man who had followed Amina with the blue cap removed his hat in the light of a press conference and, with a voice as calm as an ocean and as precise as a surgeon's scalpel, revealed himself as Tunde Obafemi, the founder and chairman of Obafemi Holdings, the man whose silhouette lined the billboards and whose fleet of cars could swallow a neighborhood whole. The cameras loved his face. The city loved to pretend it had already solved everything by naming him. But the twist was not merely that he was wealthy, it was that he had been living amongst the people in a cheap cap and a borrowed jacket to see up close what his money could not reach. He confessed that he had followed Amina because her small acts of kindness had filed into his conscience, and because he had seen in her choices a kind of moral currency his wealth could not buy. "I watched her give away the tip she needed," he told a microphone, his voice low enough that even the rain seemed to lean in. "And I could not live with the question of why." The revelation reframed everything. She was not a curiosity but a mirror, and he had the power to break or bend the world. Darkness seemed to gather after his confession, because publicity is a strange lamp that can burn those it means to warm. Tabloids wanted Amina to become a narrative. The developer threatened a lawsuit for interfering with private enterprise, and Mr. Bakari sued to evict on technical grounds while the bistro's owner, wanting to stay neutral, pressured her to sign a non-disclosure and accept compensation. Surrounded by cameras and offers that smelled of pity, Amina sat on the stairs of the clinic and held her mother's hand and realized that money given in spectacle could never buy what she had never wanted to sell, her dignity. She refused the staged photo op where she would stand beside the billionaire like an ornament. She told Tunde, "My hands work for my family, not for headlines," and chose to speak the truth rather than take a shortcut that would gift her poverty to the limelight while leaving her people displaced. It was a choice rooted in week after week of small refusals to let kindness become a commodity. And even as everything seemed to be lost, the bailiffs practiced their knots. The developer sharpened his pen. Amina held to her simple compass. The climax played out sharp and public. At dawn on the eviction day, the developer's trucks arrived, glossy and enormous, a promise of the city's future gleaming on steel. But the people did not scatter. They stood in the red dust, children linking hands, cooks with pots in their arms, and Amina at their center, not as a symbol but as a leader who had nothing to sell. Tunde, whose wealth had once bought entire city blocks in silence, stepped forward and did the one thing that both stunned and mended. He announced that Obafemi Holdings would buy the land not to build a mall, but to hold it in trust for the residents, while a cooperative could be formed to develop housing and local businesses. "You will not be moved," he said plainly. And the developer's lawyer looked as if he had been told his empire might be a sandcastle. Fisayo, who had smiled through contracts and whispered about new opportunities, was fired from the bistro for colluding with the sale. The camera caught the moment he packed his bag, his sheepishness a little more exposed than he had ever intended. The bailiffs folded their papers, the trucks left like wounded beasts, and justice landed in the small, visible ways that make a city breathe easier. 2 days after the confrontation, the courtyard became a planning room. Neighbors met under the old mango tree, generators hummed as they powered a photocopier to print bylaws, and Emeka's laughter returned like a bright motorbike slicing through the market's morning. Obafemi Holdings provided seed money on the condition they form a cooperative, and under Amina's practical insistence they prioritized permanent homes, a local school fund, and a micro-bakery that would train young people and supply the bistro with bread. "No more charity that looks like spectacle," Amina told them, and she was given a key position in the committee with a small salary and a promise of community ownership. The contrast between old and new life was visible. Where once the generator hummed to keep lights on, now ovens at the community bakery sang early with heat and the smell of fresh bread instead of the weary oil on her apron. And where danfo horns had once swallowed her footsteps, small delivery bicycles carried loaves past a gate that no longer had an eviction sign nailed to it. Her mother's pills were paid for by a community fund rather than one handout, and the Harmattan breath felt a little kinder. The consequence for the antagonist landed as both legal and communal. Fisayo, whose wolfish smile had sold his friends for a fee, lost his chance in hospitality when the bistro's owner chose trust over profit, and rehired staff who had stayed. And Mr. Bakari, who had believed old loyalties were a transaction, was prevented from tearing the block down when the cooperative exercised its right to buy the land with the backing of Obafemi Holdings, his plan foiled and his reputation diminished. The developer, who had counted on silence and stamped papers, faced public scrutiny and a new covenant between city planners and residents that blocked speculative bulldozing in that neighborhood. The cameras that had once chased Amina now followed the cooperative meetings, and the story changed from pity to partnership. On a small screen, someone uploaded the moment the old woman took first bread from the cooperative, and the city watched as a loaf passed from hand to hand, a quiet image that said the real wealth was in roofs and respect, not in golden cars parading by. When the dust settled, tangible changes settled into rhythms. Emeka returned to school on a scholarship from the cooperative's education fund. Mama Saad's stall gained a microloan to expand, and Amina, who had refused spectacle, now ran the bakery's community outreach with a modest but steady pay and the blessing of those whose lives she had touched. The Blue Drum Bistro redesigned its menu to source locally and hired back the youths who had been pushed out. And the hum of generators was now punctuated with the warm thrum of ovens and a radio that played market news instead of the sound of eviction. There were new suits among the crowds, men and women who had learned to balance ledgers instead of swallowing people's roofs. And there were small contradictions, too. A man in a blue cap who drove a new car and yet still came to the courtyard to sweep leaves, as if the humility he learned on those streets could be rented but never owned. The photo that had started the rumor of a billionaire followed a waitress who gave away her tips, now read differently on the city's lips. He had followed, yes, but he had learned to listen. Kindness, like a seed, needs water and a little stubbornness to become a tree. Truth may travel slowly, but it arrives. And sometimes it takes someone with power to see a life up close before that life can change the rules. Do not judge a person by the coins they carry at a moment. Judge them by what they choose to do with them. And remember that dignity is not a commodity to be bought with charity, but a right to be defended with courage and community. If this story touched you, share what moved you in the comments below. Tell us about a time someone's small kindness changed everything. And if you want more folk tales that sit where city skylines meet red earth, please subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. The new order came with a schedule, and the schedule carried its own weight. A council vote to authorize the land trust scheduled for Friday. A market day turned into a planning day where mothers, builders, and students clustered under the mango tree, and the air smelled of rain, bread, and the hot iron of new ideas. The wealth gap, which had always lived in the way people spoke and moved around the edges of the room, now pressed against the doorway in the form of a quiet threat from investors who wanted to turn the block into a glossy hub where the poor watched from the outside, not a place where they could walk through a door that belonged to them. Amina's team drafted a first project, a cooperative bakery funded by microloans, a school fund for Amika and his peers, and a weekly market where the elders would price the day's generosity with dignity. And she spoke softly to Amika about balancing budgets and dreams. And he, in his way, reassembled his classroom of books into a parade, because a boy who could arrange words in neat rows could also hold a future in his hands. The blue cap, Tundi's discreet symbol, stood at the edge of the crowd, listening as a mother's voice rose to insist on a newspaper-proof record of every cent of the seed money. And when she asked for accountability, he did not blink. He nodded and answered in plain terms that transparency would be the foundation, not a garnish. And the word began to travel. The word that, in this city, power would be measured by how clearly it could tell the truth and how long it would stand with those it claimed to serve. Midway through the day, a document reappeared. A missing section of the original sale papers from years past, now brought to light by a city clerk who had learned the lesson of quiet persistence from his grandmother's kitchen. And in its margins lay a second clause that could unlock a binding path to permanent housing if the community could show it had the will to walk the distance. Fisayo's shadow, which once had the gleam of a manager's smile, appeared at the doorway of the planning tent with a folder of missed opportunities and a new set of promises to get people employed. But the crowd's memory, sharpened by the cooperative's work, remembered the way those promises had melted into excuses before. And so there was a tense pause during which Amina's team asked for a public forum where the elders would speak first and the young would listen. And when the first elder rose and described a life spent juggling bills, fear, and faith, the microphone found its way to Amika, who spoke of how a school scholarship would turn a child's what if into a watch me. The room leaned in as if listening to a seed sprout in slow mud. Amina turned to Tunde then, not to praise him, but to ask whether this plan could withstand a council vote that might still bow to the old fear that a poor neighborhood could not sustain a future built by its own people. He looked at her with eyes that had learned to see both roofs and horizons and said, "If I have learned anything, it is that listening is itself a kind of leadership, and we must prove by doing that the city can be inclusive without dissolving its steel spine." The crowd erupted in a cautious cheer, and the tension between power and mercy, which had once filled the air like a storm about to break, now settled into a rhythm, the hopeful drumbeat of a people who would not be moved. Dawn spilled pale gold over the mango tree where the courtyard once trembled with fear, and the banner that had fluttered through crowds the night before now hung in quiet defiance as Emeka tugged at his sweater and asked if today would be the day their voices finally mattered. Amina stood at the gate, with her apron still smelling faintly of jollof, the clinic's posters flapping under a breeze that felt sharper than a blade, while the city's glass towers across the street glittered like distant promises as a danfo coughed to life, and a radio crackled with the talk of a new council plan that would test the stubborn edges of power. And somewhere in the hum of generator and rain-slick street, the truth refused to stay quiet any longer. The one who had followed her with the blue cap, who had watched and learned, had become something more than a shadow. And now he spoke, not from behind a veil, but from a place of responsibility, saying in a voice that carried through the courtyard and into every kitchen where bread rose in the heat, "I did not know a girl's tip could reweave a neighborhood until I listened long enough to hear the music beneath your steps." The day after the revelation's echo, Tunde Obafemi did not arrive in a limo or with a microphone, but with something quieter and heavier, two pale boxes bearing into the community room. One held copies of bylaws written in straightforward language. The other held a small seed fund and an outline for a housing trust that would own land in trust for residents and rent it back at a rate they could bear. A promise that the city would not swallow them in the night. A pledge that development would come with listening as its first condition. Amina felt a tremor run through her as pathos and pragmatism met, because this was not charity wearing a halo. It was a contract written in ink that bled into the dirt when hands touched the essay, Mepoj, and she could hear the market's breath, the tinny clatter of coins in a tin, the whisper of old ladies counting the last coins in a stall, while a small child's laughter rolled across the stones like a stone turned over by a curious aunt, a reminder that hope travels in small feet before it learns to stand. "You will lead the committee," he said, not as a ruler but as a partner. And the crowd's murmur rose into a genuine sound of relief, a sound that did not pretend the pain was over but promised it would be faced together. And for a moment Amina allowed herself to believe that the arc of the city could bend toward mercy the way a drumbeat curves toward rain. As the day wore on, the drama tightened into concrete steps with visible costs and visible gains. The eviction threat had become a legal and moral project. The city council would vote on the land trust, and if it passed, the block would breathe with new life. If it failed, the neighborhood would have to find another way, and the community would carry forward with or without the city's seal. In either case, the wealth gap remained a living argument, its walls standing not in glass towers, but in the quiet rooms where people learned to share bread and rent, where a baker's oven warmed a night school classroom, and a nurse's plea for a donor's patience became a plan for a health fund that kept Mama Said's stall open through the lean months. The turning point arrived not as a thunderbolt, but as a quiet confession from the man who had started as a follower and ended up as the provoker of a different model of power. In a moment of public testimony, he admitted that he had once believed wealth could solve everything, but now believed that governance, shared, transparent, and earned, could bless a community long after the cameras left. He pledged to seed the housing trust with a portion of his family's capital, not as charity but as a long-term bet on the city's resilience. And he offered to stand as a named donor in the cooperative's future, a visible reminder that wealth certainly moves, but listening can move wealth toward the common good. The immediate payoff came when the council approved the land trust with a healthy majority. The backroom meetings dissolved into open forums, and the people who had learned to fear the rent with every breath discovered that a roof could belong to them as a birthright, not a purchase of a night's relief. The antagonists' consequence arrived in the form of a public acknowledgement that their plans for dispossession had been thwarted by a neg. H. Borhood's insistence on dignity, a line drawn under the old rules, and an apology embedded in the community's new bylaws. By nightfall, the courtyard glowed with a different light. Oil lamps and clay pots, the bakery's first crack of bread, Emeka's sister guiding new applicants through the cooperative's sign-up sheet. And Amina, who had learned to stand tall without becoming hard, stood at the center of the circle where old friends and new neighbors shared a pot of peppery soup and a simple toast to roofs over our heads and the work we do together. The blue cap, now a symbol of listening turned leadership, stood a pace back, his face softened by relief and the knowledge that the wealth he had once pursued with a private smile could now be used to secure a neighbor's mourning, a child's schooling, a mother's steady breath. He did not speak, but his presence carried a quiet vow that whoever tried to buy this block again would find a community prepared to defend its new life with the same quiet courage that had kept them alive. The last glow of the evening rested on Amina's face as she watched Emeka pinning a drawing to the notice board, a map of the block with pathways from the bakery to the clinic and the school, and whispered to herself that this was not an end, but a doorway, a new film that would begin as soon as the lights came up again, with the same faces stepping forward to tell their part and to remind the city that the true wealth of Lagos's neighborhoods lies not in the price of land but in the trust the people keep with one another, and in a benevolent ceiling built not by benevolence alone, but by the stubborn, everyday acts of ordinary heroes who refuse to be erased. The thread left dangling, though, was this. The cooperative's promise hold when the next storm rose? And would the city's politicians stay the course long enough for the people to keep tabs? Here new home? Or would the old dream creep back in through a new doorway and threaten to wash away the work of this night?